All right, Jasmine, you are on the line. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Um, well, I've seen a lot of studies on religion and mental health that shows a little bit of a protective factor to it, but there isn't a lot of studies that appears on atheism and mental health. So I was wondering if I could get your guys' opinion on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question kind of becomes, should it be prescriptive? You know, if we see certain correlations between religious belief and well-being or other like psychological measures, does that mean that we ought to be religious? For me, it kind of comes down to the question of, is it true? Is it real? You know, if it makes me happy, do I want to believe it even if I know that it's not factually accurate? It can definitely get very messy from there, and we can get more into it. But Richard, I want to hear your point of view on all this.
Yeah, I mean, there are some studies into secular mental health and non-religious mental health, and they tend to find one of two things. One is that the real strength, the real mental health help is in belongingness. It's in groups. It's in people forming groups. So if you are non-religious, but you are part of a group, I don't know, maybe they're called something like the ACA, I don't know, something like that. If you're part of a group, you will find quite often that mental health it helps because we are a social animal. Part of our makeup is to be part of groups. We like these groups, and it helps us go. There's even evidence people live a very long time the longer they've got a group. Centennials are often people who still have a very social life, it turns out. And belongingness is very important. And the other is that maybe if you come across people who have left religion quite early on, mental health can suffer for all sorts of reasons, which tends to be part of the breaking of that group, tends to be fears about beliefs they can't let go of, like hell and things like that. And it is a process. So that's why places like out there can help with that sort of thing as well, if you're struggling with that. So there are some studies done, and also there are some studies out there that suggest that religion isn't the be-all and end-all for good mental health anyway. Just ask any Scandinavian where they have very little religion, but some of them have pretty good mental health. They're very happy people, according to the stats anyway.
Yeah, I think there may also be something of a selection bias in these populations, because if you are in a religion and it is making you absolutely nuts and ruining your life by telling you that you're not supposed to love the person that you love, or by telling you that you're not supposed to do the things that you enjoy, you might be tempted to leave that religion. And so, you know, there's a sort of sorting bias to all of this. Jasmine, how's all this landing for you?
Well, I just think like a lot of it's based on emotion, right? Of course, it's group, but you know, religion. The main pull of religion is emotion, and since Richard, you specialize in disgust, a lot of religion pulls in disgust based off of you know, in group, out group, sexual preferences. It's all based on emotion, and with the secular group, it's I guess you have to approach it differently, because there isn't the same sort of ideological framework as religion.
Yeah, I mean, some religion does have a tendency to other, not the other groups. In fact, most religions will other the other groups and will base a lot of their own identity on what they are not, as much as what they are. So I am not Muslim, I am not atheist, I am not Presbyterian, I am not Methodist, I am not Hindu, I am not whatever. And so othering does take a large part of that. And othering is a very complicated sort of cluster of emotions around it, one of which is disgust. There's also this building of hatred, this building of distance, all sorts of things that taps into the whole in-group, out-group response that we naturally have. And you're right to say, I think, that that's harder to do outside of religion, to find that kind of a group. It's often why people find themselves humanists, for example. I'm a humanist, and so I am in that sort of kind of a group, in that I have a set of sort of ideas and beliefs and people around me. And I guess if you're being completely honest, and everybody should be with themselves and their feelings, I do also other religious groups. I say I am not them. I am not one of these religious people. I am not one of these people who believe these things. I am not one of these people who have these beliefs. Because it's othering can be very, very bad. It can be the worst thing. But it's also completely natural and what humans do as part of their identity. So it can happen. And I do tell you, point, it is harder because there's not a top-down force saying, this is your identity, they are not what we are, this is what you are. There tends to be more a bottom-up kind of thing happening outside religion, where you take it from the bottom and work upwards. So yeah, it is a good point. I'm wondering why you're asking, though. Is it just curiosity, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've always been sort of, well, I think a lot of atheists don't quite understand I mean, some do, but they don't quite understand the emotional pull of religion. Mm. It's not about rationale. It's about in-group, out-group, that emotional high that the religion gives you. You can't just rationalize that away. And that's where religion can dominate.
Yeah.
So again, it kind of comes to a question of should, right? Like, should we apply rationality to religion, or should we feel comfortable with just saying, well, it makes me feel good? I mean, Richard, how do you feel about that notion of, I want to believe as many true things and I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible, if that is not necessarily leading to health or happiness or well-being? Is it still a valuable maxim?
I think it is, because well-being is a complicated thing. It depends what you mean by well-being. I think I always have a greater mental, personal, and intellectual well-being if I know that I'm not being duped, if I know reality, and if I have the honesty to say I don't know and I don't know, rather than trying to find some spiritual shaped box to fit in the hole. So I think there is a well-being element to wanting to know more true things and fewer false things. And I think you're right. I think there is a question of, yes, there's this emotional element to it. And yes, it's very comforting to have these beliefs and religions. But the hard part is finding a way to say, yes, but is that enough? Is that right? If it's not true. And you will have people, religious people, I'm sure we've all come across, who say they don't care what the science is, they don't care what the reality is, they want to have their religion. I guess some of us are the opposite of that. We don't care what the religion says, we don't care how fuzzy it makes us feel. We want to live in the real world as it actually exists and find our well-being there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, want and can both come into it, because once the toothpaste is out of the tube, sometimes if you come to the realization that there is no God, it doesn't necessarily matter if you miss your church, if you miss your community, if you miss your prayer, it starts to feel empty and you can't necessarily go back to not knowing.
Yeah, that's why so many people struggle when they leave a religion, because of that conflict, that they've changed their beliefs, and you can't really pick your beliefs. Anybody who says you can, I want them to believe right now that Paris is the capital of Japan. So you can't, it's beliefs come upon us. We develop them. They're a sort of almost a desire-based process.
We can curate them, but maybe not control them.
Yeah, we can't control. We can curate them, right? And so once you come to a belief, there is no God, but you're still part of this church. You still have this social thing. You still have these emotional attachments. You still have these tendrils of guilt, as Douglas Adams would describe them, attaching you to your home and your life. But you don't have what makes that group exist, which is the God. So it can be really tough and really difficult. And I think that sometimes when you have these mental health surveys, they're looking at atheists in that part of their journey, and then looking at nice, comfortable, happy believers and trying to compare them. And that's not a like-for-like comparison. That's just, as you say, selection bias again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where does that leave you, Jasmine? I mean, does this impact sort of your ambitions or the way that you see the world?
Well, I mean, reality testing, of course, is very important for mental health. But there is something to be said for a protective or a sort of naive viewpoint, because sometimes you need a buffer between you and the world, and you and sort of the brutal facts of the world.
Yeah, no, I very much get that. I mean, hyper rationality, hyper vigilance, and hyper skepticism and questioning everything all the time, always, is exhausting and I think far from healthy. But what do we make of that? Like, Richard, would you recommend that we all have like a little bit of delusion as a treat? How do you manage that and keep it quote unquote healthy?
Well, the good news is we've all got a little bit of delusion as a treat anyway. It's just the way it is. For example, I am absolutely gorgeous. So that's a fact. We all have some kind of delusion about the universe. And so there are things that you will cling on to, things that you believe, things that you will have that will comfort you. And it's like the guy I spoke about earlier, the guy who said he's perfectly logical because he loves his maths. We all have things we have loves for that we think are perfectly normal. I mean, if I said to that guy, you know what, I really don't like mathematics at all, I actually can't stand it, he'd look at me like I was some kind of, heathen.
Apostate, yeah.
Some apostate. So we do all have these things that we cling to, that we that help us buffer these things. And it's hard for anybody people will try to claim that they don't, and obviously that's their delusion half the time. The delusion is that they are perfectly rational. People out there, if you want to come at me in these calls, go for it. But that is a common delusion of the, if you like, the skeptical community, that no, I'm perfectly rational. I don't have anything. I'm always seeking the truth. Well, good that you're seeking it, but don't tell me you know it, because that's where your delusion comes from. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The other thing I kind of think is, unfortunately, secular rationalism doesn't, it doesn't give the same emotional high as religion can, whether that's through group, whether that's through Schlossel, or just, through prayer, meditation, and whatever other religious practice that brings that addictive emotional high, I'd call it.
Yeah, I mean, I very much appreciate that. But, you already used the term addiction. It's worth pointing out that, sitting on a mountainside on a beautiful day and meditating on all of existence and witnessing the clouds rolling across the sky and feeling that bliss isn't necessarily the same emotional high as taking ecstasy or heroin. Is it better? Is it worse? I mean, it is the same, but it isn't, for a lot of the obvious reasons. And I think some of the maybe negative side effects or consequences of those reasons might be what makes religion a dangerous thing, or a thing to be careful about. Is that a fair comparison?
Me?
Yeah, please.
I think so.
Yeah. Jasmine, go ahead.
I think you've got a point. Just to I didn't think about it, but addiction, a lot of people use religious rituals to break addiction, and a lot of the legacy treatments are based off of religion. So I'd love to hear your guys' opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to jump in very quickly by saying that like the 12-step model and AA is something I've railed against many, many times on this show. And I can't help but wonder what other types of rituals or treatment programs or things we might have if we lived in a country where there was like state support and funding for that type of treatment rather than just giving everything to AA and similar organizations. But, my axe to grind aside, Richard, how does that question land with you?
I equally have serious reservations about the 12-step program. We'll not get into things like the recidivism rates and how just generally awful it is. But yeah, I've heard people who've gone on a secular version of it where they just replace things like the part where they say you got to accept there's a higher power, except the higher power in that version isn't a god, it's your biology. You have certain peptides and proteins and they make you behave in a certain way and your brain is a certain way, and understand that that's there and that will always be there. It's the way you're made up by nature, and so you have to find a way to deal with it. Which I think I've not seen the data, but I feel like that is a better way to go through, because you're not sneaking something through the back door. You're giving them good science and the reality of it. That most addicts, they're addicts. That's what they are. It's a biological issue. It's it's like people who overeat, we now know, because there's drugs that can treat it, it's a particular set of peptides that stop you from ever feeling hungry. And you can get those peptides and you can lose weight real fast. And if you understand that that's the higher power, it's your genetics. I like that idea, but I am not a fan of the religious thing. I don't like anything where they're not being honest to what they're doing. And I'm genuinely believe that 12-step program is a proselytizing conversion program first and a alcohol treatment program second. I'm not a fan.
Yeah, and as you kind of alluded to earlier, a lot of the maybe benefits of AA are things like community, like ritual, things that might be part of a religious system, but that don't require a God belief. Like we can form community, we can have ritual, we can have these sort of stepwise programs towards change and health and growth without bringing in magical thinking.
What do you think of the secular versions of the legacy or the 12-step programs?
I mean, we're talking about a very broad number of things. So there are all kinds of different secular programs, none as big or well-funded as AA or some of these other things. But, I'm generally in favor. I don't work in addiction treatment, and so I don't want to get too far out over my skis, but I do want to point out that there is some very problematic issues with the way that we fund these programs and the way that we are not necessarily concerned about recidivism just from a capitalistic standpoint. And so there is a lot to be, I don't know, anxious or maybe even angry about when we look at the state funding and the influence of religion and some of these other aspects to it. But broadly speaking, I do think that secular treatment is not only very possible and functional, but it's existing everywhere right now, and we're seeing good results relative to.
Okay. Well, I mean, addictions is really hard. If anybody had any good answers, we would have, addictions all over the world. But quite often, people only have access to these legacy programs. There's no other options depending on your country or your healthcare systems or whatever. So would you
Yeah.
recommend that over nothing, for example?
It depends, but very possibly. When I work with clients, I will often talk to them at the very beginning about how so much of my approach is based on mindfulness and compassion-based therapies. That we are not here to beat ourselves up or to shame ourselves into change, but rather to support ourselves, to love ourselves as a way of watering ourselves as plants to see us grow. And when I work with a client who is involved with a 12-step program, I'll often mention that, we may be at counter purposes. You may be hearing or seeing things in that program that don't necessarily line up with what I understand to be good science or with what I understand to be good practice in a counseling situation. And that's one of the things that we try to kind of discuss or work around. However, I never, ever, ever tell somebody who comes to me for counseling, oh, you need to get away from that. Oh, that's a bad idea. Oh, that's a bad thing. I trust people to be experts on themselves, and I offer what information I can and what support I can. And sometimes we do find ourselves at cross purposes and have to talk through that. Other times people do willingly choose to leave AA or whatever else for some other program. But oftentimes, probably the majority of the time, they're there because it's offering them some benefit and they're able to continue seeking that benefit. And if that means changing their higher power from a God figure to themselves or their biology or however they need to frame it, we work together on that idea. So yeah, writ large, not a fan of 12-step programs. Very angry about the way that our government helps to fund and support these programs at the expense of other possible treatment options. But I would never pull somebody out of a program like that unless they chose to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a country with a government that actually tends to fund other treatment programs more often. It's a strange set of affairs when I live in a country where our head of state is also the head of a religion, and we seem to be a lot less religious. But we have things like cognitive behavioral therapy and those sorts of things. Or if you go through our NHS, that's where you'll be taken. That's where they'll send you. They'll send you to things like CBT. And I'm a big fan of CBT because I understand that it's basically modern Stoicism, and I'm a big fan of Stoic. In fact, I would call myself a Stoic, a modern Stoic, and learning to understand emotions and regulate emotions and know what's beneficial and know what works and all that kind of area, and how to manage your feelings and manage your addictions and manage your impulses and drives, I think is a better way to go than the 12-step religious program. And that's what usually we do here. It doesn't mean we don't have AA programs funded here as often. It's just, I think the choice where the money goes, especially recently, tends to be in the hand of medical experts more than politicians here, maybe.
What a thought. What a world.
Yeah. So it tends to go where it should do. And I think that will happen more due to events I won't comment on, but just happened to our NHS, and it's a very positive one, I think. So it's going to make that even better. It's going to make the experts be even more frontline on where the money's going and how it's being spent. So yeah, maybe you could adopt that over in the US. What do you think?
Would that we could.
Yeah.
Would that we would. That does not seem to be the direction that we are heading in now. As they talked at the top of the show last week, there's a lot to be concerned about. This is one small piece of the lack of separation of church and state that we are seeing in our government, and it seems to be encroaching even further.
Yeah.
Well, I think for me, pure CBT, cognitive behavioral, same complaint I have with sort of atheism, and that it doesn't sort of it focuses on the rational, and it sort of the emotional is pushed to the wayside. or at least that's my feeling or my sense of the.
Yeah, I mean, you're not wrong when you're talking
Sure.
specifically about CBT. I mean, it is a form of a cognitive therapy. So it is going to be very focused on sort of your beliefs from a mental standpoint, from a very thinking, very heady standpoint. Myself personally, I mentioned a moment ago that I focus on mindfulness-based therapies and compassion-based therapies, and those both really encourage you to be connected to your body, to bring your emotions, to bring your whole self into some of these decision-making processes. CBT is well proven to be a remarkably effective therapy for a great number of people. But if you scratch the study on a lot of those, if you scratch the surface on a lot of those studies, what you see pretty quickly is that if people drop out of the program, they're not necessarily included in all of those metrics. And CBT does have a high dropout rate because some people just do not resonate with it. So if it's working for you, if it's valuable for you, there's good science to support why CBT is a very useful and effective therapy, but it may not be the right fit for everyone. And that really does matter. If you have found yourself working with a therapist and not really satisfied with the results or with the experience, it might be worthwhile to look at different models, things that perhaps do bring your emotions or the rest of your body into the experience.
Yeah, and it all comes down to choice, doesn't it? And that's something that, unfortunately, because of funding in some cases, you don't have much choice. That's the program. I see you on Tuesday. It would be good if we had a range of choices, because there are many, many tools and many, many ways to do this. And so wouldn't it be a wonderful world if you could choose which path you wanted to take, rather than kind of being urged to one that puts money in the pockets of churches, frankly. That would be nice.
Yeah, just to tack on one more thing, Jasmine, I'll say that, there is a danger of overly maybe shopping for a therapist. If you find yourself in a therapeutic relationship and you are just not satisfied, I do want people to be curious and to look around. It may not be that you have a bad therapist. It may just be a bad therapist for you. All the research supports the idea that more important than the therapy that's being used, or the type of therapist, or where they went to school, or how old or experienced they are, like, none of those things seem to matter nearly as much as the relationship. And if that relationship doesn't feel right, I do encourage people to shop around, to ask good questions, to try and find a better fit. While also just wanting to say that if you are never sticking it out, if every time things feel a little bit stuck or a little bit uncomfortable, you're bailing, and now you've had 4 or 5 sessions with 4 or 5 different therapists, that might be the time to kind of sit back and ask yourself, should I stick this out? Should I continue despite some discomfort? But again, finding the right therapist for you is an incredibly important thing to keep in mind while we're going through these healing journeys.
Most certainly. But it brings me back to atheism and why it doesn't work for me, because to me, atheism is just sort of the icy peaks of rationale and intellectualism. It doesn't, to me, address my emotional needs, at least in my perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that it has to be that way. I can appreciate that those have been your experiences. And so I might encourage you to dig a little bit deeper, to look in some different directions. Like, yes, it breaks my heart on a certain level to realize and recognize that I will never get to meet my grandmother again in heaven. That, some of these promises of a God that is always with me aren't true, and that I don't necessarily get to have those emotional experiences. And I wake up every morning and maybe I feel tired and I want to go back to sleep and I want to be grumpy about it. And I remind myself, no, wait, this is my life. This is the present moment. This is the only one that I'm going to get. This is the only time I'm going to be here. And I choose to bring my whole self to that. And I choose to find joy and find bliss in all of that. And I can very much do that from an atheistic perspective. Atheism is just the answer to that singular question. Is there a God? Yes or no? And even that question, we can have a lot more nuance in our answers than just yes or no. But ultimately, atheism doesn't tell us how to feel. It doesn't tell us what's important. It doesn't tell us how to live. It might have some suggestions, perhaps, as a community and as a body of work and all of this, but you get to define your atheism, should you choose to, in any way that you want to. And you can find the beauty and the joy and the emotionality of it all in a number of different spaces.
Yeah, that's certainly a good perspective to take, I guess, but it's not one that I take to, you know?
Yeah, I mean, how you feel is how you feel. It's true. Yep. But I do wonder what might be nagging at you, or maybe even what prompted your call to try and get some clarity at any of this.
Well, you know, I wonder why I cling to theism, and I sort of refuse to, you know, really adopt the fully the atheist perspective, and I keep coming back to emotional needs of some sort. So, but maybe I just don't have the right perspective on atheism. I don't know.
I'm wondering if you are. I mean, as Christy just said, atheism is an answer to a particular question, much as theism is an answer to a particular question, and all the rest of it, all the community, all the groups, all the belonging, all that, to me is a separate thing. I don't wrap the answer to that question around with my friends and my family and the groups I'm in. Even as a human, even as part of British humanists, I'm not a humanist necessarily because of the answer to that question. It's a community of, using that terrible term, free thinkers and skeptics that like to answer bigger questions and look at lots of different things, and various other communities and things that I'm part of. And then there's this thing that people ask me, do you believe in God? And I say, no, it's way over there. It's this other thing. It's not, I guess, a core part of my identity. It's just something I'm interested in and find fascinating, if you like. It's an interesting question. And I think perhaps that's one of the key differences between, if you like, this side of the fence and the theist side of the fence, in that the answer to that question is the core almost of the belonging, is the core of the community. It is what the community is based around. Now, here I am talking on the ACA, which sounds like I'm contradicting myself, because obviously I'm in a community I'm in a group that has atheist and community in its name, but it's about more than that, really. It's about, you know, that separation of religion and government and all that sort of thing. So maybe from my perspective, the reason I couldn't go to the theist side of the fence is because this one thing would suddenly become almost everything. And that to me is kind of unnerving. I'd rather have this one thing that's interesting. Is there a God, isn't there? And then everything else that's my community, that's my belonging, that's my mindfulness. You mentioned earlier about religious practices, and you mentioned meditation. I meditate. So I meditate and I do yoga, hence the lathe, thin and muscular body. So it's, you can still do all these things. You can still have this connection with your inner self and with the world and with groups. It just kind of becomes a question, a bit of, I want to say a bit of fun, but a bit of an interesting thing to think about rather than the core of your identity, if you see what I mean. That's what my side, from my view of this, is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, atheism's, I'll give you that. Atheism's definitely interesting. That's why I have a sort of a fascination with atheists, but if for whatever reason, I just kind of adopt it, and probably because it does form a good part of my identity.
Mm-hmm.
Atheism, I'll give you that, is certainly fascinating.
Yeah, from the atheistic point of view, if you will, the experiences that you have in religion, in church, in, prayer or any of these moments are not supernatural experiences. They are things that can be created within your own body. They are sensations, they are emotions and thoughts and feelings that can exist without the supernatural. They are perhaps being caused by standing in a beautiful stained glass church and singing in harmony with a community of people, or they are things that are caused by being deep in the prayer closet and meditating on pieces of scripture or on, great world issues and things along those lines. It's possible to have all of those same experiences without God, without a irrational belief. And I would argue that it's a cleaner high, to borrow that metaphor, or a way to achieve those things without also bringing in all of the baggage that might come along with a bunch of like 2,000-year-old poetry written by goat herders in another part of the world. There's so much that we can value about religion without having to buy into it.
Yeah, that's true. But I guess buying into it just gives you that much more, I want to say salient feeling, or
Sure.
much more complete feeling. Yeah.
Yeah, I very much get that. I don't mean to repeat myself, but to my mind, that's comparable to saying that, I feel true bliss when I take some sort of drug and I'm going to keep doing it, rather than saying, oh, well, if my body is capable of experiencing bliss, maybe I can find that through meditation. Maybe I can find that in a way that is a little bit more grounded, a little bit more rational or safe, and that doesn't come with some of these negative side effects. I do believe that same level of saliency, that same level of imminence, that feeling deep in your body can be achieved through non-religious means. I myself grew up in a very evangelical environment. I fell under the Spirit of the Lord. I prayed in tongues. I did all of this wild and goofy shit that at the time was deeply emotional and sincere and very like true to my body. Is not necessarily the same religious beliefs as a like staunch Presbyterian, but it was for me very real and imminent. And later in life, I have found so much of these same mental states through trance, through hypnosis, through meditation, through, things like yoga, like Richard mentioned. These things are just part of having a human body, and there are ways to access them if it's important to you that don't necessarily require, taking on some of these irrational thoughts.
Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, the last time I went to a soccer game, when my team scored, a 6'8", 250-pound man who I didn't know picked me up and hugged me and kissed me on the forehead and put me down. It was a moment of absolute and pure bliss. So you can get it outside church, that kind of bliss. It was incredible. And so it's there. There are ways to access that. Just find yourself a 250-pound, 6'4" guy.
Yeah. So, Jasmine, I hope that we've given you a lot to think about and helped you kind of wrap your mind around any of this. Is there anything else that you wanted to just touch base on or maybe kind of circle back to before we start to wrap up?
Yeah, just that the DSM-5 has no... it does address sort of spiritual, issues, but it doesn't address religious trauma, and that religious trauma isn't a category currently in the DSM-5, if I'm not mistaken.
No, that's true. Folks like Marlene Winnell and others have worked to perhaps include it in future editions of the DSM. As somebody who works in religious trauma, I have somewhat mixed feelings about that. I do think that there would ultimately be some benefit depending on how the next version of the DSM is sort of broken down and how it's organized. But to say that it's not in there might be a little bit of a misnomer, because we already have so many diagnoses that are centered around trauma, and the source and the nature of that trauma, whether it was a car accident or a hiking accident or a murder or a, abusive parent. Trauma is trauma, and the source of it matters, and there are like important distinctions to be had. But I would say religious trauma is covered by the DSM, and folks who are struggling with nightmares of hell, folks who are struggling with loneliness or isolation because of the messaging that they grew up with as a kid, they are experiencing trauma in exactly the ways that the DSM describes.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all my questions.
Great.
Beautiful. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share all of this with us and to, consider some of these points of view. I think our goal here has not been to try and like force a particular thought in your direction, but to help you understand that you can live a beautiful, happy, healthy, connected life with community and bliss and deep emotion and true sincerity without having to buy into any sort of magical thinking or irrational God belief. And I hope that information is just helpful moving forward. Thank you so much for giving us a call.
Thank you.